There's a question that seems too simple to be philosophical. A basic math calculation disguised as a moral dilemma. 5 is greater than 1, so saving 5 and sacrificing 1 seems obvious. But the more you look at that question, the more you turn it around and examine it from all sides, the more it refuses to be answered easily. Because the real question is not whether 5 is greater than 1. The real question is whether human lives can be added, subtracted, and compared like numbers in an equation. And the answer to that question will determine not just what you think about a philosophical thought experiment, but what you think about medicine, about war, about politics, about justice, and about the kind of society you want to live in. Let's start with the most intuitive argument, the argument that most people accept before thinking deeper. If you can save 5 people at the cost of 1, and if all lives have the same value, then saving 5 is 5 times better than saving 1. The arithmetic is straightforward. Letting 5 die when you could have saved them all at the cost of 1 is a choice that results in 4 unnecessary deaths. 4 families torn apart that didn't need to be. 4 sets of dreams, memories, relationships, projects that were erased unnecessarily. How can this be fair? This argument has a name. It is the consequentialist argument, and in its most developed form it is called utilitarianism. The central idea is that the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. A good action is one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. A bad action is one that produces more suffering than joy, more harm than good. And within that logic, sacrificing 1 to save 5 is just not allowed. It's mandatory. Refusing to do so for any reason is morally irresponsible. Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century British philosopher who is considered the father of utilitarianism, went so far as to propose that every moral decision could be calculated through what he called the felicific calculus, a formula that measured the intensity, duration, certainty, and scope of the pleasure and pain produced by an action. In this view, ethics would be almost an exact science. You calculate, you act according to the result, and that's it. The problem of ethics would be solved. But the problem is that this view, taken to its logical consequences, produces conclusions that most people consider horrifying. And here's where the debate starts to get truly interesting. Think about the following. If it's fair to sacrifice 1 to save 5, then why isn't it fair to sacrifice 10 to save 100, and 100 to save 1,000, and 1,000,000 to save 10 million? The logic is the same in all cases. The smaller number is sacrificed for the benefit of the larger number. But as we scale, what seemed like a reasonable solution starts to look like something very different. It starts to look like the arguments that have been used historically to justify mass atrocities. The good of the people, the good of the nation, the good of the race, the good of the class, always invoked to justify the sacrifice of the few for the many. Utilitarianism, applied rigidly and without limitations, can justify torture if the torture of an innocent person produces life-saving information. It can justify slavery if the forced labor of a minority sufficiently increases the well-being of the majority. It can justify medical experiments on people without consent if the results benefit a larger number of patients. And in each of these cases, the math works. The larger number outweighs the smaller number. But something is deeply wrong. This is the moment when political and moral philosophy introduces the concept that is at the heart of the alternative to consequentialism, the concept of rights. The idea that each human being has a series of protections that cannot be violated regardless of the consequences, that certain things simply cannot be done to a person, no matter how great the benefit to others, that there is a boundary around every individual that cannot be crossed without their consent, and that crossing that boundary is wrong in itself, regardless of the outcome. This perspective has its roots in Kant, but was brilliantly developed by the American philosopher John Rawls in the 20th century. Rawls argued that a just society is not one that maximizes average or total well-being. It is one that protects the fundamental rights of each individual, especially the most vulnerable. And to arrive at principles of justice that were genuinely impartial, he proposed a famous thought experiment, the veil of ignorance. Imagine that you don't know what position you will occupy in society. You don't know if you will be born rich or poor, male or female, healthy or disabled, in the majority or in the minority. Behind this veil of ignorance, you have to choose the rules of the society in which you will live. What type of society would you choose? Rawls argued that, in this condition of ignorance, rational people would not choose a society that maximizes average well-being, because this could result in a society where the majority lives very well at the expense of the extreme suffering of a minority. No one would choose to risk being that minority. And this has direct implications for our question. Behind the veil of ignorance, would you choose to live in a society where it is considered fair to sacrifice 1 to save 5? Would you choose this knowing you could be that one? Most people, thinking carefully, say no. Because the risk of being the person sacrificed, of being reduced to a means to the end of others, is a risk that no rational person would accept about themselves. But here there's a complication, because behind the veil of ignorance, you too could be one of the 5. And so, would you choose a society that protects the 1 at the cost of the 5? Would you choose this knowing that you could be one of the 5 who dies because no one wanted to sacrifice the 1? We see that even the Rawlsian experiment does not solve the problem cleanly. It helps us think more impartially, but it doesn't eliminate the fundamental tension. And this tension is real because it is rooted in 2 values that both matter deeply and that, in certain situations, come into conflict: the value of individual dignity and the value of the collective good. Let's now explore this conflict in a different way, moving away from philosophical thought experiments and into the real world. Because the question of whether it is fair to sacrifice 1 to save 5 is not just academic, it is answered every day in concrete contexts by real people with real decision-making power. Think about medicine. There's a medical principle called triage, from the French trier, which means to select. In mass emergencies, such as natural disasters or battles, doctors do not have the resources to treat all the injured at the same time. So they prioritize. They treat those who are most likely to survive with treatment first, and leave without immediate treatment those whose injuries are mild enough to wait or too severe to be saved. It is a way of sacrificing the good of some to maximize the number of survivors. Screening is widely accepted as necessary and ethically justifiable in resource-scarce situations. But what about when we move from emergency situations to health policy decisions? Suppose a public health system has limited resources and has to choose between financing a very expensive treatment that saves 1 patient's life or financing cheaper treatments that improve the quality of life of hundreds. This is a real, everyday version of the dilemma, and health systems face these choices constantly. In Great Britain, the public health system uses a concept called QALY, Quality Adjusted Life Year, which measures the cost of each medical intervention in terms of the years of quality life it produces. Treatments that cost a lot per QALY produced are refused, because the same money could produce more years of quality life if invested in other treatments. It is explicitly a utilitarian calculation, maximizing the total benefit to the population with the resources available. And that means some people don't get treatments that could save them because saving other people for the same money is considered more efficient. Is it fair? It depends on what moral framework you use to evaluate. Within a utilitarian logic, it is not only fair, but necessary. Within an individual rights logic, it is disturbing because it means that the healthcare system is explicitly valuing some lives more than others based on cost-benefit calculations. Now, let's move on to another field: war. In situations of armed conflict, military commanders make decisions that inevitably result in the death of some of their own soldiers to save others, or to achieve broader military objectives. A platoon can be sent on a suicide mission to protect a strategic position that will save a greater number of lives. A commander may decide not to evacuate a position, so as not to reveal his strategy, knowing that the soldiers in that position will be killed. Over the centuries, military ethics has developed a set of principles to deal with these situations. The principle of double effect, which has roots in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, distinguishes between intended consequences and foreseen but unintended consequences. An action may be morally permissible even if it causes harm, as long as the harm is not the means by which the good is achieved, but merely an anticipated side effect of an action that is good in itself. This principle is used to justify collective damage arterial to civilians in military operations. If an attack on a military installation predictably results in the deaths of nearby civilians, this may be justified as long as the military target is legitimate, the military benefit is proportionate to the civilian harm, and the civilian harm is not the means by which the benefit is achieved. But in practice, the boundaries of this principle are often contested, and there are cases in which what is called collateral damage in military parlance seems indistinguishable from sacrificing innocence to achieve objectives. Here we come to a crucial point that is often ignored in philosophical discussions on the subject: the question of who decides. In the Trolley and 5-in-1 thought experiments, it is assumed that there is a neutral agent with decision-making power who is trying to make the morally correct choice. But in the real world, decisions to sacrifice some to save others are made by people with interests, with biases, with unequal powers, and historically, those who are sacrificed are rarely those who have the power to make the choices. Slavery was justified in terms of collective good. The economic progress of entire nations was built on the forced labor and death of entire populations of people who were considered sacrificable. Colonialism was justified as the civilizing mission that would benefit the world, while destroying cultures, ecosystems, and lives in colonized regions. Medical experiments carried out on prisoners in concentration camps were justified as contributions to scientific knowledge that would benefit humanity. In all of these cases, someone made the calculation that the many would benefit from the sacrifice of the few. And in all these cases, the few had no power to contest the calculation. And this reveals something fundamental about why the logic of sacrificing one for the good of the many is so dangerous. It is extremely vulnerable to being co-opted by those with the power to determine who is the one and who is the many, who is sacrificial and who is saved. This does not mean that it is never justifiable to save more at the cost of less. It means that any moral framework that allows this needs extremely robust safeguards to prevent it from being used as a cover for systematic oppression. And history suggests that these safeguards are very difficult to maintain. There is a philosophical perspective that attempts to navigate between pure utilitarianism and the absolutism of individual rights, and which I find particularly illuminating. It is the perspective developed by the American philosopher Michael Walzer in the context of the ethics of war, but which has broader applications. Walzer argues that there are absolute moral rules that cannot be violated, even in extreme emergency situations. But he also recognizes that in certain genuinely extreme situations, what he calls moments of supreme emergency, leaders may be forced to violate these rules to avoid worse catastrophes. What is crucial in Walzer's view is that violating absolute moral rules, even in supreme emergencies, is never simply right. It is always a moral tragedy. Whoever makes the decision to sacrifice the innocent to save many carries a real moral weight, a real guilt, even if the decision was necessary. There is no formula that completely absolves those who make this decision. And this is important because it means that the logic of sacrifice cannot become routine, cannot become bureaucratic, cannot become something that is done lightly because the numbers say it is the right thing. There is something profoundly wise about this perspective. She recognizes the complexity of the real world, where sometimes there are no choices without harm. But she also insists that harm is always harm, that the death of one innocent is always a tragedy, regardless of how many others are saved. She refuses the easy comfort of a mathematical formula that turns suffering into an abstraction. Think about what happens to people who are forced to make decisions like this in the real world. Doctors who in pandemic situations had to decide who received a ventilator and who did not. Firefighters who had to decide who to save first in a fire with multiple victims. Military pilots who had to make split-second decisions about targets in conflict zones. Many of these professionals develop trauma. They develop what psychologists call moral injury, a wound caused not by fear or physical danger, but by the act of having caused harm to others, even in circumstances where it seemed necessary. This suggests that even when we intellectually judge that a decision was necessary or even correct, something in us recognizes that the harm caused is real and has weight, that there is no divine calculating perspective from which the sacrifice of the one for the good of the five appears simply neutral or positive, that the perspective of one, of the person sacrificed, it has a moral validity that does not disappear simply because the numbers do not favor it. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, developed an ethics that starts precisely from the recognition of the other's perspective. For Levinas, fundamental moral experience is not calculating consequences or following abstract rules. It is the encounter with the face of the other, with their concrete vulnerability, with the appeal that their existence makes to you simply by existing. When you look at the face of a human being, you receive an ethical call that cannot be reduced to calculations. You're facing something that demands recognition, respect, responsibility. Within a Levinasian ethics, sacrificing the one for the good of the five is not a neutral mathematical operation. It is to ignore the appeal of one's face in favor of an abstract calculation. And this is always violence, even when circumstances make this violence apparently necessary. But let's go back to the question we started with. Is it fair? And perhaps the most honest answer we can give after exploring all this complexity is, it depends on what we mean by fair, and the answer changes depending on the perspective we adopt. If fair means producing the best outcome for the greatest number, then yes, it might be fair to sacrifice one to save five, in the right circumstances, with the right safeguards. If fair means respecting the inviolable dignity of each individual, regardless of the consequences, then no, it is never fair to use a human being as an instrument, even to save others. If fair means what rational and impartial people would choose for the society in which they live, the answer is ambiguous, because it depends on which risk you consider more unacceptable, that of being the one sacrificed, or that of being one of the many who die because the sacrifice was not made. What the philosophical debate offers us is not a clean answer. It's a deeper understanding of what's at stake. It is the awareness that when we make or approve decisions that involve sacrificing some for the good of the many, we are not carrying out a neutral operation or simply following the mathematics. We are making choices that reveal which values we prioritize, who we consider sacrificable and who not. which lives count most, and why. And perhaps the most important moral work is not finding the right formula that justifies sacrifice in a clean, residue-free way. Maybe it's remaining uncomfortable enough with these decisions not to make them lightly, to always question the criteria that determine who is 1 and who is 5, to recognize the real weight of the harm done even when it seems necessary, and to build societies and institutions that minimize the situations in which that horrible choice needs to be made. Because in the end, the most important question is not whether it is fair to sacrifice 1 to save 5 in an abstract, controlled situation. The most important question is, what kind of world are we building, and what kind of people are we becoming by the choices we make when faced with impossible dilemmas? And this question has no mathematical answer. It only has the ongoing weight of the moral responsibility of those who take seriously what it means to live among other human beings,